Good evening, everyone. This is Nick Cullen Carroll, and today you are here to observe a presentation of a draft of my Chapter 1 introduction for the dissertation process. I'm still in the beta stage for titles, but I'm thinking of something along the lines of wellness and preparedness or readiness questionnaires and surveying physical education high school aged students. A lot of titles in there, and I'm going to need to mix that around a little bit, but I think I'll eventually figure it out. So, a little background information. Physical education is a topic that is used from K through 12 education, as well as up into some of the collegiate ranks for education. And there are various topics that are meant to prepare kids for adulthood. One of those topics in the process is physical education, and that's geared towards physical literacy and helping individuals how to deal with psychological, social, and emotional stress with physical education interventions. And in the state of California, it's required to have 2 years of physical education through the high school process. And you can also enroll in various other upper division electives for physical education to determine the types of topics that you want to utilize to stay fit for life, as we appreciate calling it. The standards for physical education are very vaguely defined, but there's 3 of them that are extremely important. And the third one is the one that I'm going to focus on here, which has to do with demonstrating knowledge in the sociological and psychological realm as it pertains to physical activity. And within this standard, there's a substandard that states that students are supposed to understand their personal and psychological responses to physical activity. They're meant to record their responses and evaluate them over a period of time. But it's one of the most underutilized standards that I've seen in physical education, and I'll leave it at that. So the first study that I visited in the background was a study by Hooper et al. That just looked at preparedness surveys as they pertain to overtraining in athletes. And Hooper identified a couple different scales. Mainly he focused on the profile of mood state, or the POMS as we know it, and it gave you a total mood disturbance score. And this was able to give an idea of a mood state, a self-reported fatigue, signs of distress. We could identify some stuff such as soreness, irritability, stress, maybe some sleep and diet quality scores. And he determined that it was a very effective scale for understanding some of these external factors in athletes. That was a past literature study from 1995. Let's look at a little bit more recent study from 2010. Kelman wrote a paper looking at a similar scale. Again, he was utilizing elite athletes, a lot of aerobic-based athletes in this evaluation of literature. And there was a different scale used called the REST Q Sport. And again, similar to the POMS, it was a very extensive scale that looked at things like general emotional, social stress, conflict, fatigue, lack of energy, complaints, success, well-being, sleep quality, emotional exhaustion, accomplishment, self-efficacy, and it helped you measure these certain emotions, I guess you would say, on a scale from 1 to 6. And again, it was found to be, as I mentioned, it was found to be effective for looking at overtraining or looking at perceived recovery in these athletes. And then the most recent study that I'd like to talk about is from 2019, and it uses a scale that I think is more relative to what should be used in physical education. This came out of Australia, a strength and conditioning coach by the last name of McGann et al. There was a group of them who took a pre-training camp, and they used a wellness/readiness to train questionnaire with a 1 to 5 paradigm, and they just asked questions about 6 different topics. They were looking at mood state, sleep quality, energy level, muscle readiness, previous day's diet, and stress level. And each number corresponded to a different qualitative phrase as well. So for example, the 1 on the previous day's diet would say that I ate nothing but processed foods, I had no fruits and vegetables, and I did not hydrate. And then the 5 in that same scale would say everything that I ate was mostly whole foods or natural foods, and I achieved my goal for all the servings of fruits and vegetables that I needed for the day, as well as stayed hydrated. So it's a little bit easier to grasp what a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5 means, as opposed to seeing a word such as previous day's diet and just giving a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now this study was done in elite Australian footballers, but I saw this as a scale, as I mentioned, that was a little more palatable for individuals who could even be younger. Now, assigning activities and not just physical but written activities in a physical education setting becomes extremely complex, especially when you have districts that range in California that can see 250 kids per day, and then districts that also have PE teachers that are seeing 75 students per class with no cap on how many students per day. So it becomes very difficult to make physical education a subjective experience. And the use of these preparedness scales offer just that particular ability, which is to make physical education a subjective process again, rather than a class geared towards passing a standardized test. Because it's important to take into consideration when you're teaching physical education, you're not just teaching kids how to do pull-ups and squats, running the mile, pacing. We're also trying to teach them about certain mood states, how to perform exercise when your energy levels are differing, whether you're ready to perform or not, how sleep and diet and stress can affect your exercise routine, your training plan, and ultimately your performance in a longitudinal setting. So let's look at some of the gaps in the research. I think one of the major gaps that I've seen in preparedness surveys, and maybe it's just because nobody's found it pertinent yet, is I haven't seen a lot of preparedness and wellness or readiness to train surveys in the high school population. I remember a classmate from this particular program actually brought up a paper in the NSCA that looked at evaluating individuals' perception of motivational climate, but that's besides this PowerPoint. What I really wanted to focus on is just if high school age students could predict their readiness to train based on their wellness scores. Another gap in the literature would be longitudinal studies, not only for preparedness and ready to train surveys, but also for those types of surveys in this population. I think it would do a lot of service to have semester long, school year long, and then 4-year quadrennial cycles, just looking at the ebbs and flows of an individual's wellness profile over the course of high school. And I think that that could not only have implications for the daily adjustments in an individual's PE program, but possibly for a lifetime. And then I think a third major gap in the literature would be establishing an appropriate scale for readiness and wellness in a high school physical education setting. As I mentioned previously, I think the POMS, as well as some of the other scales that I mentioned, might be a little bit too complex for these individuals who are, let's just say, psychologically and emotionally underdeveloped. And I'm in no place to say that either. Being on the other side of 30, I still think that I believe that there are some things that it's difficult to identify emotionally and psychologically. But when you're working with high school students, I think you recognize really how underdeveloped they are when it comes to understanding emotionally and psychologically what their needs are. And I think it begins here with being able to identify where we're missing on asking them the right questions and how we can appropriately develop that emotionally and psychologically in physical education. So now we come to our problem statement. So the purpose of this project is really broken into three parts. Can we measure preparedness or readiness and wellness in high school age physical education students? Can we do that accurately? Can we do that precisely in this age group, in this subpopulation? Then the next question would be, can we do this over time? Can we do this over the course of a semester? Can we do this over the course of a year? Can we do this over the course of 4 years? Is it going to make a difference? Are we going to change the way that students emotionally and psychologically reflect? As well as, are we going to change the way that they physically perform just by exposing them to this information? So let's look at some of the hypotheses we've derived from our problem statement. I think the initial hypothesis is readiness and preparedness and wellness surveys in high school aged physical education students are valid and reliable in their ability to assess parameters such as readiness for exercise, sleep quality, diet quality, energy, anxiety level, and mood and soreness. Our second hypothesis would be that our students are able to assess these parameters accurately and precisely in a long-term setting for a semester or for an entire year, or even for that 4-year process if this project can carry on that long. And then if we could get around to it, this is one of the questions I'm still kind of asking myself. Maybe we would need to compare it to an external measurement like a counter movement jump or a broad jump. And then another hypothesis on top of that would be, could we validate these internal measures to correlate with external measures for monitoring individuals, maybe for overtraining, undertraining, whatever that final question or hypothesis might be. So I'm pretty limited from this point on in the definitions section. I tried to identify a couple of things that I thought were kind of vague. I know that I mentioned high school aged quite a few times, and we're not going to be visiting a subject section in here, so I just wanted to define that high school aged is between the ages of 13 and 19, which is a pretty large age gap, not only when it comes to chronological age, but biological age. And I understand where the assumptions and limitations lie with that particular factor. Another definition that I wanted to give was the definition of wellness, and we're going to define that as a term used to describe the holistic health of an individual, including properties such as sleep, diet, physical fitness, and then psychological fitness as well. And then the last definition that I had in here that I thought was kind of vague and maybe people would need a description of is preparedness and readiness, which is an individual's perceived willingness and effort prior to an event. And this can be based off of their current stress as well as their current mood. And then it could also be factored from prior qualities such as sleep the night before, diet the day before, as well as previous exercise sessions in the week, month, training phase. So let's take a look at some of the assumptions and limitations that I have laid out for us. So the first assumption that I have is that the scale that I create will be accurate and it will precisely measure the wellness and preparedness of physical education students. Another assumption is that students will have the awareness or cognitive abilities to accurately and precisely rate their wellness and preparedness. A third assumption is that the students are going to adhere to the survey, especially if it's over the course of a semester or a school year or a 4-year process. That might be a daunting task for an individual of this age. And then the last major assumption that I have laid out to us is that these scales will actually provide value not only in the social emotional realm for these students, but also provide the instructor with valuable information to maybe not manipulate, but adjust the workouts pertinent to the individual process. There's a good chance that these will individually measure nothing and not contribute anything. Let's look at some limiting factors. I think one of the major limiting factors is that with a brief, concise scale, there could be a lot of components to wellness and preparedness that we do not measure and we completely miss, and if they were included, might have made an impact on the study. I think another limiting factor is that it's going to take place in an action setting or a live setting, meaning that we're going to lose a lot of internal control on the experiment at the expense of making it an applied or an action-based study. And then I think another limiting factor is that this scale that we create might only be pertinent to the population that we administer it to with the school of choice. And then the last limiting factor, I think, is that the scale could be effective, but let's just say the training programs or the curriculum that the students are exposed to might not be challenging enough or might be too challenging to elicit any changes in the wellness and preparedness profile to show if it's effective. So I want to finish off talking to you guys about the significance of this study. I think mainly it adds emotional and psychological value to physical education for students. A lot of kids just associate physical education with physical things like sport and exercise, and they don't understand the social and psychological benefits to it. And so I think this is a major way to introduce kids to those holistic benefits that we sometimes completely bypass, not only as instructors, but even as participants. We fail to see that there are a lot of emotional benefits to exercise. And I think overall a scale like this, as basic as it could be, could add some of that value to help kids become a little more engaged in the process and not disassociate their emotions with the curriculum. I think the second major reason for its significance is it's going to force kids to start taking a personal stake in physical education. You know, part of what we try to teach students, and some of us are still going through this process with our instructors and our advisors right now, is how to accept challenges, how to know when to accept challenges, and how to know when to back off and take a little rest before you step into that next challenge. And something like a preparedness and readiness survey is going to teach kids or give them the tools to understand when they're ready for that next workout, or when they need to sleep a little bit more, when they need to clean up their diet a little bit, when the stress is a little bit too high or the mood is just not right for an activity, or maybe it is right for an activity. And I think this has greater implications for adulthood in this population than it does just with physical activity and physical education. I think at a minimum, students just at least become aware of their mood states, their stress levels, the food they put in their bodies, the quality of sleep, and how it can affect exercise. And then a student that truly chooses to engage with this survey on a daily basis and let it affect the way that they exercise, they're going to start understanding how the fluctuations in some of these tiny little factors can help them to auto-regulate their training. And auto-regulation is becoming kind of a prime factor with just about every individual who's choosing to train, from elite athletes to people who are health impaired to everyday people. It's nice to know where your body's at and what kind of activity that you should be able to handle, and that's going to have a lot of positive implications on people moving in the future. Which leads me to the final reason why this study has some significance. Engagement in physical activity, I think, is always the goal for most of us in this field, and something that offers individuals an opportunity to take part in the physical literacy process can be something that battles apathy and indifference towards physical activity. I mean, it's pretty. There's a lot of evidence in the news as well as published papers on PubMed talking about obesity and overweightness on the rise in just about every developed nation in the world. We see sedentary lifestyle becoming a major risk factor, overtaking other unhealthy lifestyles such as drinking, smoking. And then we see that these two factors together contribute to all-cause mortality and a rise in things like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, as well as various cancers. And so something like this, again, that offers individuals the ability to just see where they're at on a daily basis might be an opportunity for them to open their eyes, like we mentioned, to greater sleep, to greater diet, to understanding when they're ready to train and when they're not ready to train. And then it gets them engaged in avoiding overtraining as well as avoiding undertraining. It's a difficult equation to solve, and I think it's just another approach from a different perspective that might have a positive effect on this particular student population. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my audio or read my poster for my Chapter 1 introduction draft for a future project, hopefully for dissertation, regarding wellness and preparedness or readiness to train surveys in high school physical education students. Have a great night.